I'm Andy. I am going to talk to you all about algorithms, connected tech, and generating all the real-world evidence that we've been talking about today. So some disclosures, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Electra. It's a for-profit company, and also have grant and research support from the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Sciences. And then a bit of my background. So I told you my current affiliations. I'm a software engineer by training. I'd served at the FDA in the digital health unit working on software as a medical device, machine learning, AI strategies. Also worked with a company that's creating a digital therapeutic. So they're creating effectively a video game for pediatric ADHD. So if anyone thought that playing video games would rot your brain, there might be the first prescription one ever. Be fun. And then I served also at a private equity firm and then in consulting. So my overview of today's talk, I'm going to talk to you a bit about digital tools, and intentionally I don't use the word device because in many instances these are not devices by the FDA, even though colloquially we may refer to a lot of these as devices. So wearables, not everything is necessarily worn. An overview of what people mean when they say decentralized clinical trials. There are no blockchains here from all you San Francisco people. These are just trials that happen outside of the clinic. And then data rights and some governance considerations for the data that's generated. I always struggle with the term real-world evidence and real-world data because people use it quite loosely. Like, is it just data that was collected outside of a traditional RCT, or is it things that are more quality of life data? I think there is definitely a regulatory definition that some people use. And then we're going to focus today on the type of data that is generated in a home setting. Particularly, I spend more of my time on these sorts of connected technologies and not as much time on COAs and clinical outcome assessments. Okay, so before we start, a couple definitions so we're all saying the same thing. I think one of the things that makes this field particularly hard is when you're starting to bring together engineers and data scientists and clinical people, we all say things that are kind of different. So for example, when someone says, is this data validated? Do they actually mean, is it verified? Is it clinically validated? Is it analytically validated? Or is it useful? And so I've been working with a number of people to start to put a stake in the ground about what these terms mean in the digital era. And we published a book. It was an accident. It was a blog post that got way too long. And it has cartoons, so it's not like so painful. And if you want, actually my Twitter is Andrea Corvos. And if you send me a message, I will send you any of the slides from this deck and everything else that's in here. And it's at the bottom of the slides. Okay, so in the clinical outcome assessment world, there are generally 4 types that are talked about in regulatory settings. When we start to add in technology, the first 3, I mean, people are probably aware of, they're more driven by who is using this sort of data, so patients, clinicians, observers, there's also performance outcomes. But then once you start to put in technology, are they the same? Do you just put an E in front of it, it becomes an ePro, or are there actually different considerations that we have as you start connecting these sorts of mobile tech to them? Historically, I think a lot of clinical outcome assessments have been considered separately from biomarkers, but the emergence of digital biomarkers starts to make these things a little bit less clear. About 2 years ago, if you all haven't read this yet, this is probably one of my all-time favorite documents. A number of leaders at the FDA realized that no one actually knew what they meant when they were talking about biomarkers, or some people said them a little bit differently. And so a group from the FDA met up with the NIH, and they outlined 7 different types of biomarkers. It's probably one of the best overviews that I've seen. Of course, some people, I say that kind of colloquially, of course people know what biomarkers are, but often they're saying different things in meetings. And so if you think about what is a digital biomarker, it's really one of the 7 existing biomarkers, but it's collected through digital era, or some sort of digital and connected tools. So it might be a diagnostic biomarker that's collected digitally, or a safety biomarker. And so it's really helpful to really articulate which types of data are being collected. So these software products have a wide range of application. The way I generally like to think about it is, are these algorithms and sensors measuring, are they diagnosing, or are they treating? And so this is generally the classes of digital biomarkers or clinical decision support, digital diagnostics, and therapeutics. And so as you're trying to build safe and effective algorithms, you'll see I try not to use the term AI because all AI is just algorithms. Some learn, some don't. You would probably want to think through how trustworthy are these algorithms to take the measurements, the diagnoses, or the treatments that you're using. So for example, the reason why this sort of validation process is actually quite hard is that you're mixing hardware and software together. So what you can see is these are 5 different types of products that are supposed to measure AFib, which is an abnormal heart condition. Across the top are different types of hardware and software elements along the supply chain. So each of them have an operating system. They often have some sort of sensor, like the green light sensors that you might see on the back of your Fitbit that's measuring some sort of how your heart rate is performing. That signal has another signal processing. Then you would make a decision on that, and then that data is pumped through an app. Each of these 5 different companies, some of them now are going through FDA clearance processes for these, have create some of that stack of software in-house, and then some of them are apps that might sit on top of a watch or something else. And so the reason why this stuff gets really hard is it depends who and what company is actually creating each of the different steps along this process of software. I'm gonna go through some of these quickly, but effectively these are not just like consumer products anymore. The FDA is starting to clear them, and a number of different companies have created now products that are considered software as a medical device, which is effectively decoupling the software component from hardware. And so that means that devices now don't necessarily have to be physical. They really weren't always. These are now pieces of code that are considered devices. And then the company that I was working with before I served is, and I had mentioned before, is creating a video game for pediatric ADHD. And so kids play this game for 30 days. It reduces their ADHD symptoms outside of gameplay. They structured themselves like a drug company, so they run a clinical trial like the asset is this software product and use traditional endpoints to measure the effectiveness of it. So how do you actually know if these things are trustworthy and something that you might want to use? And this is not an easy question. There's a number of different companies and tools and consortia that have started to tease out what are the elements that we should consider. These are 2 good ones that I would look into. So CITI is a FDA Duke public-private consortia that is looked at mobile technologies. They'd originally, if you want like cocktail trivia later, they'd originally called this mobile devices. Many of these are not devices. So if you're using a digital tool in your clinical trial, most likely it is not a device and would not need to go through CDRH because you're not making a device claim. You're using a tool to support a drug application. And so these are 2 resources that you can start to go and look into if these are things that you're considering in some of the research that you're doing today. Okay. So we have these tools. Perhaps there are some that are more trustworthy or less. What do they enable? So in any new field, everyone, I think, generally introduces a lot of new terminology, and I was getting very confused when people were talking about virtual trials versus remote trials versus decentralized trials and direct-to-patient trials, and like, what are all of these things? So this is my understanding, and had published a paper on this with one of my colleagues from the FDA about how to deconstruct what these things are. So for example, one element is, where are the data captured? So are you at some sort of research facility, or are you collecting in a remote location, or is it hybrid? And so that would be if somebody knows something like Science 37, they go out and they collect maybe your blood draw or something else from your home. So that would be the data is collected remotely, not at the research setting, but the data is blood, right? And your blood's not a digital product. So that would be, you would need a human to be able to collect that. So that would be a remote study, but not necessarily a virtual study. And so a virtual study would be one where the data are captured traditionally through some sort of connected tool. And so if you're running a study that maybe is measuring tremor and you're using sensors to do that, you might have a fully virtual study, but that might be happening in your clinic because you are collecting all of that data using a digital technology. I think a lot of people ask then, should we all be using decentralized studies? And my answer is probably not. And it would make a lot more sense to reflect generally what patients want. So I personally hope I never have to draw my own blood. Like, I would prefer a phlebotomist to do that for me. And so if I were in a study, I would not want it to be fully, quote, driven by the patient. And I think a lot of these things we want to mix and match based on what people would want. I'll kind of go through these quickly so other people get to talk about it, but this isn't just in theory. A lot of these tools are starting to be used. So Achille, which is the game that was creating the digital therapeutic for pediatric ADHD, they're also working with Pfizer on developing a neurocognitive assessment, so to determine early types of indicators around Parkinson's. So depending on how somebody plays the game, they have been creating some sort of surrogates around cognitive decline. And the nice thing about this is you can run these at home in a natural setting where somebody is already performing in the setting that they would be in and not necessarily have a different setting when they're in the clinic. Another is using a lot of actigraphy, so how somebody moves and walks. We all have these accelerometers and gyroscopes that are measuring steps, and in many instances, these can be perhaps more predictive of hospitalization than other performance measures like ECOG. So, and the nice thing about a lot of these connected technologies is you can collect a lot of data in a short amount of time. So if you're running a clinical trial and you only get to collect one data point a month or one data point a quarter, it takes a very long time to get a holistic view of somebody. But if you're able to collect multiple data points over a period of a day, you can have a much better sense of how somebody is performing. Okay, so let's say that these tools are safe and effective. What about the information that's collected on the tools? So I would say our healthcare system today has a lot of strong protections for biospecimens. We know how to handle things like blood and genomic data. We have not created sufficient protections around people's digital specimens. And contrary to what a lot of people would say, I very strongly believe that there is no de-identification anymore. So there are ways that you maybe could, under a regulatory framework, possibly make things more de-identified. But realistically, who here thinks you could fully de-identify my genome? Probably not, because it's not my genome anymore if you wouldn't do it. It's unique to me. And so I'm uniquely identifiable with 30 seconds of walk data. Like, the way I walk is a biometric signature. As you collect more and more data on people, de-identification becomes functionally impossible. So that's not necessarily bad. I mean, there's not really a way to do personalized medicine without having this level of detail on people. But what does become important is the governance rights. So who gets access and when do you want that to happen? And so I think a lot of us need to start moving away from talking about data ownership, because you probably aren't owning your data. Multiple people are going to have access to it, and much more about the data rights and management and who gets access and when, and did you allow that, and think about what that would mean. All right, who here knows, actually just raise your hand because I'll be very excited. Who here knows what DEF CON is? Okay, so DEF CON is the biggest underground hacking conference in the world. You can think like Ed Snowden, like you do not bring your phone or computer. The last year, there's a main DEF CON and then there's villages that sit underneath. So last year, you might have seen in the news, they bought a bunch of voting machines, one of the villages, and then they hacked them and found all the voting records and sent those back to Congress. Yeah, and it was very cute. They had like a 12-year-old girl do it on one of the easy ones. And you're like, all right, great. So there's a village called the Biohacking Village, which does some biohacking, but they also do a lot of work around security research. And security research is effectively, there's white hat and black hat hacking, where black hat is like you hold a company for ransom. White hat is that you're testing a system to see if it's secure. So any connected tool that's connected to the internet is vulnerable. It's not a matter of when it will get hit. I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's when. And so how do you manage disclosures and updates? We can talk about this more on the panel, but if you think about things like pacemakers, blood infusion pumps, all of these things have vulnerabilities, and so you really want security research teams who are looking at these different types of tools. So as of a couple years ago, the FDA has been attending DEF CON, which is pretty wild because NSA goes, CIA goes, but they always go undercover. Like, you don't want to be generally a Fed that's public. They have a game called Spot the Fed, and it's like kind of, a thing. But the Biohacking Village has been working with the FDA to bring in regulators, to bring in med device makers, and to really start working together. This happens in 3 weeks, so if any of you want to start attending DEF CON, don't bring your company or personal computers, but I think this would be a really good way, as you're starting to use connected tech, to make sure that it is safe. 2 last things, and then we'll go to the next speaker. As these connected technologies start augmenting or changing the role of our clinicians take Hippocratic oath to do no harm. Should the software engineers and the security researchers and data scientists also take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm? And this really opened up an idea around, we have professional societies for clinicians, like we have ASCO and we have others. What is the professional society for those who practice in the digital era of medicine? And so 3 months ago, the Digital Medicine Society launched. It's a 501c3. If this is at all interesting for you, I would highly recommend you join. It's a group of people who can answer questions that you have around informed consent, these different types of tools and other things that I've talked about in this session. So I think we're in a really important time in this system, and we have a lot of opportunity to change and shape it. And so I don't love the move fast and break things idea in Silicon Valley, because in healthcare that means people die. And I think we should build a much more intentional one. Also, not changing means people die because it's too slow. And so we do need to figure out the right sort of system to make these things come to fruition. Thank you.
That was great. I'm James Gully. I'm a medical oncologist at the NCI, and I'm just going to share with you a couple of projects that we have started there in a program we call our Intelligent Health, or iHealth program. And we're doing this in collaboration with the FDA. So I'm going to go through these first couple of slides very quickly to get through to the projects, but basically, as a medical oncologist, what we're practicing today really is reactive health. When a patient comes in, when they have symptoms or when they have sickness, and then we try and take care of it then. But really what we want to get to is a place where we're practicing proactive health, and really we can be told if there's something going on before it gets to a point where it's serious. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So when we talk about these tools, what we really want to know is it technically feasible? Is it clinically relevant? And is it cost effective? And I think for patients with cancer, I think we can develop a system that meets all of these goals. So just to mention that we talked about patient-reported outcomes, and should these tools be considered EPROs, and I would say yes. So our first project is a project where we're using a mobile sensor technology. We're doing this in collaboration with industry and the FDA, and we're looking at the feasibility of using an app on a phone alone or in conjunction with a wearable device developed to collect data and compare it with current methodology. So one of the things that we're doing is with this wearable device is we're looking at, can we look at performance status? So performance status is something very important in oncology. Turns out in multiple trials, if you look at independent variables, in trial after trial, one of the most important independent variables predictive of outcome of those patients is how well they are doing. If they can be up and about, if they can take care of themselves, versus if they're limited in what they can do from their symptoms, from their disease. And The problem with this is it's based on patients' recollection. And they may not remember what they've done very well, or they may have biases saying that, well, we really want to get this drug or this clinical trial, and so we're going to just kind of tell a little white lie and say, yeah, we're doing fine because we want to get this. If we had a better way of getting verifiable data, perhaps we could use these digital wearable devices to get digital data that could improve our veracity of the data. So we're doing this, but in conjunction with an app on a phone, so we can look at other aspects like their level of fatigue, and then we can compare that with validated nomograms. We can also look at cognitive response time and compare that with validated nomograms, and then other things like ototoxicity. So this is our first project that we're doing. This has been IRB approved. We plan to open this trial in September. The next project that is a project that we're looking at is looking at pain recognition. So one of the things in oncology is we have a lot of patients that have pain. And how do we currently categorize that? Well, we have a pain level. We say, do you have, what is your level of pain now between 0 and 10, where 10 is the worst pain you have in your life? And they give us an arbitrary number, and that may be different for each patient. One person's 5 may not be another person's 5. And so what we're trying to do is see if we can have a better way of analyzing this pain and following it over time, but also not just waiting until they get to the doctor's office to ask them, but this is something that they could do at home. And so have them be able to take a picture of themselves or actually a video of themselves, and we'll be able to capture facial features that are associated with pain response, as well as auditory features. So we can see if with just the voice, can you tell the difference between pain and different levels of pain, as well as other things like anxiety, stress, and how can you try and fool the camera? So this is something that we are going to be doing, which the trial concept is undergoing review right now. We have a clinical trial agreement, and this is in collaboration again with the FDA and Booz Allen Hamilton. Third project is a EPRO in collaboration with Jefferson and Moffitt and the FDA. And what we're doing is we're using this patient-reported outcome tool to try and monitor the patients, and perhaps not just get feedback from what's going on with the patients, but actually provide data back to them. And really the idea here is, can we catch things early that need to be caught early and intervene so that we can prevent bad outcomes? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So if you have something where you're looking at the patient here on the left-hand side, and you have this tool, it can give the patient reminders if something happens or if something is supposed to happen. It can also be used to educate the patient, and then it can also be used to provide a data stream back to the provider. The provider can analyze that data, see if there's some red flags, and then query back to the patient and have them introduce an intervention. So one of the things that has been done with this is looking at ways of breaking this cancer fatigue cycle. So when a patient with cancer has fatigue, often this fatigue is quite debilitating, and the patient says, oh, well, I really need to slow down, I need to take a nap now, and then they decide they're not going to get up and about, and then they get physically deconditioned, and then they get more fatigue, and then they can't do their normal activities, and so then they again decrease their activity further. Well, really what should happen here is there needs to be an intervention where you turn this the other way and you increase your physical activity. So this was in collaboration with Heather Jim at Moffitt, and this is one of the things that she has done there. And they've developed several different modules: activity pacing, sleep hygiene, and the fatigue module. And basically what they were able to do is they were able to take a group of lung cancer patients, and they were able to come in with an intervention. And I'm just going to show you the high-level data from that. And you can see at baseline, in patients who had the intervention, you see the fatigue levels decrease substantially if they got the intervention versus no intervention in the dotted line. And their quality of life also went up substantially if they got the intervention versus the control, just showing feasibility of coming in with an intervention and helping the patient. So coming back to the National Cancer Institute, I work at the NIH Clinical Center, so it's the largest clinical research center in the world, and our numbers in the NCI, these aren't terribly large numbers necessarily, but all of these patients are on clinical trials. So about 2,240 new patients and about 35,000 outpatient visits this last year, just in the NCI. And this is only one of the 27 institutes and centers that make up the National Institutes of Health. So there's a big patient numbers that we could potentially access for digital health initiatives. So this just shows you some of the timelines for these studies that I mentioned. The performance status in the pain studies should be starting later on this year, and then the PRO studies early next year. I'm an immunotherapist. I look at immunotherapy for cancer, and what we've seen recently is really some dramatic responses. We see rapid, deep, and durable responses across a wide range of different cancers. However, there's widely variable response within a given well-defined subset of patients. And this is perhaps driven by their underlying immune status. And one of the things we know that can affect the immune status is stress. So in this large meta-analysis, they showed that there was, chronic stressors were associated with suppression of both cellular and humoral immunity, perhaps because of the increase in glucocorticoids, which can decrease the activity of these immune cells. And we have pretty good ways of measuring stress with these wearable devices. So heart rate, potentially the facial recognition, and the question is, could you impact with an intervention, decrease the stress levels, and perhaps improve the activity of these agents? These are all things that are answerable and all plans that we have to do in our clinical program. So I'm just going to leave you with this slide then. This slide, comes from the New Yorker, says you can't list your iPhone as your primary care physician, and I would say, of course that's ludicrous. Or is it?
Here we go. So I guess 5 o'clock on a Friday counts as the plenary session, so thank you all for sticking around. I'm excited to be here. I'm here on behalf of XCures and Cancer Commons, who are normally represented by Marty Tenenbaum, and I think many of the people here know Marty. He's been in this space for a long time. But a little about me, I'm a pharmacologist. I've been working in clinical research for about 20 years now. I started in child psychiatry, and I ran a couple of pragmatic trials at Duke many years ago, but I had a great opportunity to learn from people including Rob Califf. Since then, I've been mostly working in oncology. And, up to about a year ago, I was leading global operations for a large clinical research organization that ran about 120 oncology trials a year. I eventually got hooked up with these guys at Cancer Commons and XCures, and this is a patient advocacy organization, and it brought a very different perspective to me, that actually led me into the real-world space. And it's really been an eye-opener. So Cancer Commons has been helping thousands of patients every year navigate cancer treatment, including finding clinical trials as options. And so when you start working every day with the parents of kids with cancer, helping them try to find and get into clinical trials, it really changes your perspective. It is not easy to get into clinical trials. And that's what Marty found. Marty was riding very high. He invented a bunch of things that are used in e-commerce, and he became very wealthy right around the time he was diagnosed with metastatic cancer. And he spent his intellectual and financial resources towards finding a trial for himself and then trying to create something that would help other patients through that very arduous process. Together, Marty and some other AI researchers at Stanford created XCures to really try and take the work that the patient advocacy group was doing, helping patients, and try to find a way to scale that effort. I will tell my little joke about AI versus machine learning because it's late on Friday, but you could tell something is machine learning if it's programmed in Python, and you can tell it's AI if it's written on a PowerPoint. So I think this really tells it. I even caught myself writing it here, but that's what they call themselves. In fact, they're computer scientists, and there's some statisticians and physicists involved in this effort, as well as clinical researchers and, of course, advocates. And their goal is really a global learning system for cancer. So I'm actually here to talk about perpetual trials, but this was really the approach that we put into place to try and implement this vision for helping cancer patients. So when they first talked to me about a perpetual trial, I was thinking about something like I Spy 2. You have an umbrella design, you add arms, you take arms off, and it runs in perpetuity, kind of in the same space. And that's what I had in mind. And then as they explained to me what they do and the fact that they work directly with patients, caregivers, and sometimes their physicians, it really struck me that what they were trying to do was a perpetual registry of these things. But they felt like this structure ultimately could translate into an ongoing method for bringing together data, including real-world evidence. And so what they're running now, what we have, is an IRB-approved patient-centric outcomes registry in cancer. And I think it has several key points, which is what Marty would really encourage everybody here to think about, and I would encourage you to think about as we talk about big data in patients, is to be doing this for patients, but with patients as well. So this operates with explicit informed consent from all the patients. They know what they're getting into. And even beyond that, we're really trying to make this actually part of the process of helping them through sequential lines of care, whether that care happens in clinical trials, expanded access, or other types of therapy. So through this process, we gain direct access to the medical records under HIPAA, and I think this is something that has been an interesting process to navigate, but ultimately the patients, not the hospitals, own their records, and that is an important thing to think about as we enter this era. I can tell you, dealing with hospitals, that most hospitals do not believe that. We also use patient, clinician, caregiver surveys. So real-world data becomes a lot more interesting if you have lots of similar directionality across your outcome measures. And so if the patient and their caregiver are both telling you something on a patient-reported or electronic outcomes assessment that moves in the same direction as a liquid biomarker or radiographic biomarker, then of course you feel more confident in calling a response. And I think this also relates to the challenges that we have of determining what is analogous to response in a clinical trial in this setting. We're also very interested in integrating patient utility, which I heard people talk about utility, but we're talking about it in a sort of different way, which is the kind of benthamic utility of, essentially, what are the patients trying to achieve when they seek cancer care? And that's a very different thing for different patients, and we find that continuously. And once you get to know the patients and their families, they have specific goals. And it's important if you're trying to do trial matching, for example, that you're actually considering what it is in terms of the risk benefits that the patient is seeking in order to better match them to a particular option. And I think that sometimes gets lost because we are so interested in trying to get patients into trials. I'm going to say a couple of quick things here, but I was asked to be a little controversial at the beginning, so I will, although maybe I'm preaching to the choir with the slide. But basically, 10 or 15 years ago, this was actually pretty easy. You had single companion diagnostics to go with your targeted therapies. The last 2 years, some of the people who were up here earlier have made that a lot more difficult. We now have 10 to 100 and maybe approaching 500 or 1,000 targeted gene markers now with which to try and identify potential logical medical treatments. This actually makes some of the stuff we talked about earlier much, much harder. So trying to control for covariates in a 10-dimensional space is still possible, but trying to control for covariates in 100 or 1,000 dimensional or a million dimensional space, if you're talking about gigabytes for patients, requires actually very different methodologic approaches. Now, fortunately, I think in clinical research, we don't have to figure that out because other people in technology have already figured it out for us. But it does mean that doing traditional clinical trials will be harder and very different. I think you heard it alluded to earlier that the data sets that are being submitted are smaller. Precision oncology is making the population smaller, which makes it a lot harder to enroll. And that's only going to continue. And it becomes impossible to sort of convince yourself that the patients going into a randomized trial are all going to be identical or independent and identically distributed if you know 4 gigabytes of data about each one. Then the question really becomes, what are the techniques to figure out what in that data matter? This slide I borrowed from my colleague Jeff, which I think also might be controversial for clinical trialists, but I think is a really good example of the slow pace of research and development. So this is a graph of clinical trials studying the MGMT biomarker for temozolomide therapy in glioblastoma. This is now roughly in practice, and it took about 15 years. Jeff, who's an information theorist, analyzed this with Spencer Hay at Harvard, who some of you may know. And they basically have the same sort of decision analysis process as ants foraging for food, and you can apply the sort of same kind of logic criteria and generate that. Jeff's point as an expert in search is that there are smarter ways to search now, and I think nobody in this room would disagree with that. So another point, another controversial slide here, but there are really too many trials and too few patients. And so there's a lot of effort to match trials to patients. There are 3,500 open immuno-oncology trials right now. So ideally, if you're an advocate trying to help match to a patient to a trial, that should be easy, but it actually creates different sorts of problems. Somebody said 3%, I've heard 5% in cancer, but basically 1 in 20 patients are enrolling, and if the work that people have done, some of whom are in this room, including at the FDA, encourage people to enroll more patients, we might get to 1 in 10. And there's a lot of disparity in that process, geographic disparity, socioeconomic disparity. At the same time, we're trying to recruit 600,000 patients into immuno-oncology trials. We're actually enrolling about 50,000 a year, so some simple math tells you that we're not going to fill those trials anytime soon. And this raises an ethical question, which is related to some interesting scientific questions in general in terms of things like the multi-armed bandit problem. How do you decide ethically which trials to fill if we're all competing for this limited population of patients in order to maximize patient benefit over time? And I'm not going to answer that question. I don't know that there's an answer yet, although we have smart people thinking about it. I would just say that, we either have too many trials and too few patients, or I don't know. It's definitely not working for patients, I can tell you that. So what we've been trying to do with our patient-centric outcomes registry is build a framework so that we can bring data together from different sources for all the patients all the time using explicit consent, but with a specific value exchange, which we're taking this patient data, real-world data, and we're running virtual tumor boards of experts in specific tumor types right now. So we have pilots going in pancreatic and brain cancer. Bringing together the patient and their doctor from the community to discuss the case with experts, and then using molecular data and other things, trying to help figure out treatment options. And the patients are looking for options. At the same time, what we found is, and I think people on tumor boards have found, oftentimes the patients aren't getting what the tumor board thinks they should get. And I think the rates are anywhere from 20 to 50%, but they're not very good. We've actually had productive discussions with insurers who are interested in this and interested in making this sort of thing happen. We ourselves have gone out there, not just trying to match people to trials, but to really push and promote expanded access, and the FDA has done some great work promoting expanded access under the theory that if the trial made sense, the drug in the trial made sense for the patient in a trial, if they can't be in the trial, it still may make sense, and so we need to do our best to bring the treatment to the patient and then gather data on it over time. And increasingly, the FDA has said they're very open to looking at that data for regulatory decision-making. It is informative and it is valuable. And then finally, to close this sort of learning loop, you need to track the outcomes. And so for us, it's tracking all the outcomes on all the patients all the time, but to do it in a way that you're working with the patients in explicit consent. I put the slide in here because we're trying to integrate, like everybody else, all sorts of data from different sources, and I think you've seen people in various versions of that slide, but that's my version. So again, AI, this is basically, we're trying to use rationale capture, NLP, and in order to partition our search space, understand what experts think when they make decisions, and use those recommendations to help improve future decisions for other patients. It is too much to do this with big data. There are not enough patients, there's not enough data. It will be too slow without an integrated human expert and machine learning system. As I said, we're really trying to do ethical trial matching, and if trial matching doesn't work, to get something to the patient. And this is a growing process. We have an expanded access program that we're doing right now, and we're hoping to do more. Finally, collecting outcomes. We're trying to do the same thing, and I heard lots, and I was hoping to hear more from Deb about what they're doing, but gather and structure this data, put it into a Part 11 compliant database, comply with HIPAA and FSMA and all of these regulations, how to parse all of these interesting data sources and find common coding, and then how to equate that to outcomes that we all understand from our clinical research experience. So this is not easy, but I think we're trying to do it like everybody else is trying to do it. We would like to be part of a consortium where people are working together and keeping in mind that this is about patients and people are dying. So I would just leave with this, that a perpetual protocol can answer new and different questions. It's a different research framework, but we think maybe a more powerful one than some of the more anonymized approaches that people are using. We are actively looking at interesting questions right now and accumulating data on things like which drug or combination for which patient and why, matching treatments with rationales, understanding and developing guidelines when there is no guideline, and there's a lot of people interested in this. How did prior therapy modify or mediate response? And this is an important thing in cancer that is really understudied, is how does the prior treatment change the tumor evolution in a way that is a predictor of future treatment response? And this is one of those things that we rely on randomization to tell us that it doesn't matter, but we know it matters. So I think that's a very important thing to explore. And then if we start to define this huge high-dimensional space of patient data, how do we define phenotypes in that are actually important to study? And this is a whole area of research that I think is going to be a very interesting and productive one. But it is necessary if we're going to start identifying signals in small phenotype populations, especially if we're not doing randomized trials as often. So that's kind of the goal, perpetual protocol to build a learning system in oncology. Hopefully that was fast enough that we'll actually have time for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for staying. We will keep this fun. So I'm Andy. What we'll do is we have some time now for a panel. And what I'm hoping everyone will do is introduce yourself and what you're generally working on, but also in the last 5 years in this field that we're all in, what have you changed your mind on? So like, what would you tell yourself 5 years ago that you have now think about it differently? We'll start there and then go.
Am I going first?
You are.
Okay, great. So my name is Pallavi Mishra-Kalyani, and I am a statistician with the FDA. I don't know what I can tell you that I've changed my mind on. I've changed my mind on many things, but I think it's been a very evolutionary process. I think we're establishing that here today, that the way we thought about real-world data in general 5 years ago is very different from how we think about it now. I guess one thing that I will mention, and this is just a direct comment about a presentation, and then I'm going to let the rest of the panel discuss, is that I 100% agree that we don't have enough patients to do all the trials that we would like to do. I think the numbers that you had for immunotherapy trials speak volumes. I will say there have been multiple initiatives by the FDA. I know that Dr. Sridhara and Dr. Pazdur have talked extensively about doing things like multiple experimental immunotherapy arms compared to common control arms within a single trial, where there would be no cross-treatment comparisons or other types of adaptive design, and industry has been very hesitant to take on any of those design types. So while I do think that, yes, real-world data is an opportunity, and some of these designs that you all have been speaking about are opportunities to explore and potentially develop some supportive evidence, there are randomized trial designs that would save a lot of patient life, and we should explore those options as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
I mean, it's not always the FDA that's holding everyone back.
Yeah, I'm glad you responded. I'm glad that was controversial enough to get somebody to respond. I think a lot of us. I was going to put a slide in there on. I won't reintroduce myself, but master protocols and umbrella protocols. Again, another area that the FDA has really done a nice job of trying to put guidance out there to encourage people to do it. And then in practice, it is super hard to line up industry consortia to do that. I think from the Cancer Commons perspective, like CancerLink, I think it's sometimes easier to do that under a nonprofit umbrella. And some of the people on our team were involved in setting up PanCan's Know Your Tumor registry. But this is hard if you don't collaborate, and it is hard to collaborate in the space.
Hi, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, I'm Stephen Lemery. I'm Associate Division Director in Division of Oncology Products 2 at the FDA. I'm also, was diagnosed with lymphoma in December, so I have a patient perspective as well. And I'll just mention really quickly the thing that's evolved, since I've been at the FDA is, the ability to approve drugs based on very small data sets. And what's different is really the drugs, especially these targeted populations, have such big effects. It seems like a no-brainer in a lot of these cases. So I think that's one thing where there's been some evolvement. As a patient, I do have a couple comments. One is, I hear some of these comments about the slow clinical trials, and I think one of the biggest impediments is the geographic barriers. And I did really like to hear the just-in-time clinical trials that was mentioned earlier. I think, for example, if I relapse, my preference would be to be treated at the NIH, but if they didn't have a trial for me, the trial that would be available now would be at Baltimore, looking at CAR T cells versus transplant, a randomized trial, which is an important trial to be done. But, will I be able, with three young kids, to be able to go to Baltimore and go back and forth if I get a neutropenic fever? I don't know. So I think geographic barriers are important. And admittedly, that's a type of trial that every center can't do, but there are so many types of trials where a new TKI, for example, against a mutation or fusion, that can be done almost anywhere. And so I really like the just-in-time approach. Concerns that I have with this whole everything we're hearing now is, one is informed consent. Are doctors really trained to do informed consent for digital data? I don't know. I'm not as facile about digital data as many in the room. So, and many of us have to do the consent. When I was consented to do whole exome sequencing for myself, there was a doc who's not a doc, but a geneticist who spent almost an hour with me, and I'm an oncologist. So I don't know how much consent, do patients really understand what's being done with their genomics and with their data? Another concern I have is, it was mentioned about patients are worried about their data being sold. Well, there's another type of conflict potentially where a drug company could contract with the company that owns the data to preferentially list a drug on a report that a patient gets. That's not okay. It's not an FDA thing, but as a patient, I think that's not okay. That the drug that may be listed first, or that may be an advertisement, is influenced by those kind of scenarios. And finally, the other concern I have about my data, and I really like the thing that was mentioned earlier about having ability to control your data through a portal. I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I want to do it. Is give my data to bona fide studies that'll generate bona fide results. I'm not okay with my data being used for fishing expeditions. And that's my personal approach as a patient, not as a regulator. So I do feel it's important as a patient that we have some control of our data to know what kind of studies are being done with our data. And I'll leave it at that.
Hey, I'm James Gully again. So what have I changed? Well, so I think maybe it's less what I have changed and more what I have grown in my convictions on. So one of the things is siloed data. So there are a lot of great companies getting great data, but these data are within the company confines and are not available to outside researchers. And there are many such silos of data. If these could be centrally put in a central repository, I think there's a lot we could learn from that. And I think that's one area that we need to grapple with. And potentially, understand what is the ethics of not sharing this data? What are the implications of that for our patients? I guess the other thing I would like to echo is what Stephen said with the just-in-time, the barriers to clinical trials. I think that is, there are many barriers to patients going on to clinical trials, and one of them is geographic, and I think that anything we can do to improve the feasibility of doing studies in the community or where the patients are, I think that's going to be good.
Am I on? Yeah. So my name is Rohit Borkar. I work for Novartis. I head up the U.S. Oncology Health Economics and Outcomes Research team based out of New Jersey. As a disclosure, I have stocks with Novartis, and whatever, these are my opinion and not Novartis's. So to your question, I can confidently say 5 years back, I was 5 years more naive than what I'm today. I'll start with that. But just throughout the day, we have seen so much innovation happening across different spheres of RWE and RWE. And what we have seen in the last 5 years, it's really encouraging, right? There has been a huge growth, and I think from my opinion at least, I think what are we trying to achieve through all these innovations is better patient care, as simple as that. And to me, as soon as I think about better patient care, the first thing that comes to my mind is a patient journey. And I know that concept was discussed multiple times throughout the day. But what I'm really getting at is, I think we quickly, near future or I don't know, at some point in future, we need to be able to seamlessly, but in a credible and reliable way, completely map the patient journey as he or she navigates through the health system, be able to then pinpoint on any kind of pain points, not just for the patient, but all the stakeholders involved in that patient journey, and then figure out ways to mitigate or eliminate some of those or all of those pain points, right? And for that to happen, I think all of us need to create real strong incentives for people on the front line. What I mean by that is physicians, nurse practitioners, including patients, whoever are collecting the data and providing the data, so that they can collect the data in a form that's research worthy and is credible. Because just see today, there's so much advances happening in computational analytics, AI, machine learning, data storage. But for us to be successful, I think these innovations have to be complemented by commensurate advancements in getting the right data, because that's where it all begins. So I think that's my kind of change in thought over last few years.
Should leave it on, right? Thanks. My name is Oliver Bogler, and I don't really work in this field, so I can't really answer your question and won't. I'm here, I work at the Echo Institute, but I'm here because I'm a patient. I'm actually a male breast cancer patient, so I'm super excited about real-world evidence because of what we heard this morning. So a shout out to Dr. Krauss and Pfizer and the great work they did. I was diagnosed back in 2012 with stage 3, so I'm not yet eligible to benefit from his work. Hopefully I never will. But if it does happen, I'm excited because I've been advocating for more inclusion. I mean, it's super hard to be a middle-aged white guy and fight for inclusion. But men are only included in about a third of breast cancer trials. And sometimes it's for good reason, right? We don't have the right kind of disease and whatnot. But even when we do, we're not always routinely included. So, and of course, if we were included, we'd be such a small number of patients, you wonder whether there would be any biological data that came out. So real-world evidence is an incredibly exciting development to at least allow us to keep up with the women and the therapies they're getting. So that's awesome. And what an amazing day, right? I mean, we heard just amazing things that people are doing in the private sector, the public sector. It's tremendous. The future is super exciting. It is very unevenly distributed. So I completely echo my colleagues' comments about barriers to clinical trials. But you know what? The same geographic barriers pertain to the standard of care, right? African American women die more, earlier from their breast cancers, right, in this country. So those barriers are formidable, and that's actually what we work on at ECHO. So, that's a thing we really need to solve in many different ways. And I think a lot of the things that I see and that hasn't really been part of today's conversation is how do we address these things as a society, on the civic level? I agree with our chair. There is no such thing as anonymized data. Every time a company tells me how much they're protecting my data, I laugh because every company will have its time when their data get hacked. I mean, it's kind of seems to be a universal affliction. So I wonder if we don't need to come up with technological answers and civic answers to this. And one of the things I wanted to mention is I've been following what's going on in India. I don't know if anybody else has in their IT world. They are not encumbered by an built-in infrastructure of EHRs and balkanized systems and this stuff. So they're coming up with national level solutions. And if you look at their National Health Stack strategy document, which is part of the India Stack effort, go to page 30. There's a beautiful diagram there which shows you that the patient owns their data, that there are health data fiduciaries that allow that patient, it's a database of one. They get to control their data. They get to give access to other people, whether it's their doctor, their hospital, or a trial or what have you. But they are empowered, and plus the advantage is you get a holistic view of it, right? I mean, I've lived in the States for over, too many years, 25 years. Every time I move, boom, right? Disruption in the health record. So there are models for this. I know it's really hard because we are here today where we are. It's just like our cell phone. We're going to have the worst cell phone net pretty soon. We already have not good internet and so on. Anyway, but on the civic side, I think the risk is even bigger. And I get the discussion around commercialization of data. I mean, there's lots of ways to commercialize data, right? I mean, companies get bought by other companies, and there's a big payday and so on. Maybe patients are upset about it. I'm personally not. I mean, I went through 10 months of cancer treatment. Every single thing that touched me was the product of a commercial company, right? The drugs, the scalpels, the anesthetic. I'm good with it. That's how our world works, right? I mean, so does the coffee I drink and the car I drive. I'm not worried about that. But what I would be super worried about is if data, and I'm thinking largely of genomic data, right? If I'm a metastatic cancer patient, hope I never will be, but then my risk calculation is very, very straightforward. I'm very risk happy because I'm trying to, save my life. So I'll probably give my data away freely. I'll sign the consent form without reading it and without having it explained to me, whatever. Just give me the drug, doctor. I want to live, right? But what if I'm sequencing my genome? Am I now disclosing, the next 10 generations worth of risk. And, let's not kid ourselves. So here's my answer to your question 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I would have said, well, you know what, America's amazing. We're not going to. We live in an environment where there are elected officials in this country trying to take health insurance away from fellow citizens, okay? Let's not kid ourselves. If you are marked genomically with a high risk of something, there is very potentially a future where that will have an adverse effect. Now, you might tell me I shouldn't watch so much Black Mirror, and maybe that's true, but those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I can only watch Black Mirror like once every 6 months, and I need to just take a break from it. Okay,
You're making Black Mirror. You don't need to watch it.
we are. I mean, this is one of those things, right? All these things, any tool is a weapon or a benefit, right? Like personalized medicine has all the different sides for it. So we can't pretend like it's all good, but it's not all bad. We just have to figure out how we want to use these things. Like nuclear power is energy and a bomb, okay? Okay, we're going to open this up to people who have questions. We'll start there.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm Howard Fingert. I'm in industry and I work on international trials. And many of you have said some very insightful things that strike me as being very applicable to the US. But in terms of the problem we have in trying to accelerate and get trials done with rare indications, we really do need to go outside the US. So I'd like to hear from you if you can give me kind of insights on directions, advice that we, other stakeholders, can make going forward on how to get some of these concepts, let's say, adopted and agreed to going forward at a more international level. I'm aware the ICH E8R1 guidance just came out in June for public comment, and very thoughtful comments in there about using external data to supplement trials, something Mark Levinson commented before. So I think they're talking about like 3-to-1 randomization or 4-to-1 randomization, and then but you still reduce the N and therefore accelerate the trial completion. And that's kind of heartening because the ICHE8 is signed off by people across all regions. So it provides some interest for those of us that want to have sharing of both the conduct of the trial as well as how the outcomes are acceptable across major regions. Steve?
I mean, I think in some of these cases, you have a company that like Roche who owns Flatiron Foundation. I mean, I think they're international companies that are, but I mean, they have to work with the electronic health records in different countries, and that's a problem that's really outside our scope. I mean, I think it probably can be done, but it takes a lot more work to do. I don't know if any, sure.
So, I didn't say too much about my background, but I was responsible for a team running oncology trials in about 40 countries, just up until recently. So I have a lot of experience trying to navigate the legislation that's applicable. And one of the things that I was interested in working with XCures was the fact that actually I don't think it's necessarily a truism that you have to do these trials internationally. And in my career, I started to see single phase 1 dose escalation oncology studies done in 3 continents. And I can tell you, in a practical sense, it's really hard to manage that. It drives up the cost tremendously. So like literally doing trials in Korea or Taiwan, the United States, and the UK, for example. And that's actually become increasingly common. But it makes for a very difficult, very expensive process. Partly my slide about all the trials in immuno-oncology in the US is because most international biotech companies that want to co-develop with immuno-oncology drugs want to do it in the US because there's a chance insurance will pay, whereas they won't pay for background therapy in these other countries. Which actually kind of floods our opportunity. It's an opportunity for patients actually here, but it does actually create other challenges. So, in terms of real world data, you open up a different and very difficult thing. Almost every one of these countries has their own data privacy regulations, including some that are specific to healthcare and some that are general, like GDPR was mentioned earlier. GDPR is tough. I mean, to try and do what some of these companies were doing would be, I think, and I'm not a lawyer, but I had to deal with thousands of contracts every year, I think it would be close to impossible. And I think it's like that in certain other countries. And then there's other countries that actually have a lot of regulation around their own patient genomic data, which we're trying to combine. But other countries that don't want that genomic data exported outside their country. And so you end up having IT infrastructure in every region where you're housing patient data. I mean, it's multiplicatively complex.
I wonder if you flipped it, though, if it would be as complex. So right now, what you're saying is it's hard to take other people's data and put it into your systems. But if the data stayed with the patient system, if it stayed in that locker that belonged to the patient, and they gave you access to it, maybe flipping that might make this problem much easier, the GDPR data.
Right, no, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that the system does not respect the fact that the patients own their data, which I think is generally what we as a society want. And if we did that, it would actually make it a lot easier to allow them control. I mean, there's so much cool stuff going on, like with hash graph technology and things like that to allow more control. Like, people are probably scared of cryptocurrency, it sounds like hackers, but that actually has tremendous potential to help patients own and control their data in this environment.
So, Mark-
I'm just going to pause everyone just because we only have until 4:30. We've been asked to wrap up a bit early, but I love this conversation. If you're interested, come to it afterwards. One thing about crypto, blockchains are public. The reason why you have a blockchain is that is it a public blockchain. Bitcoin, Ethereum, everything else. So this is one thing to remember afterwards. So if you do not want your data in a public forum, you should not put it on blockchain. So remember that. If you want to have a distributed data set, which a lot of these things can do, there are private distributed data that can be good settings. But if we enter into the blockchain discussion, that is public data.
Thank you. To close, though, I do think that ICHE could be an opportunity for harmonization going forward. That's its whole purpose. And the fact that it's been signed off now, at least the R1, by so many people from across the regions, also adds hope that maybe we could find a way to harmonize going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
I hope for that too. All right, thank you. Last question for us.
Thank you so much. A great discussion presentation. I'm Xiaohong Fan, one of the medical oncologists that work in FDA, Center for Biologics. My primary actually interest is gene cellular therapy for oncology indication, but real-world evidence to use that to help with the regulated medicine and drug development is my emerging developed passion. So I'm glad to have this discussion. My question is, who actually talk about the future, and then who will take the lead in terms of assuring the quality of data collection and data analysis, and talk about who owns that data, and in terms of the future, will there be any consortium at the national level or international level, or any society, any like RWE, a society will come up? Or I'm thinking about the recent, like it's a moonshot of a cancer cure. I'm wondering with this RWE, would it be Earthshot? Right. Anyone comment?
Am I on? Mm-hmm. So I think, as I was saying earlier, the quality responsibility to a large extent would fall on people who are producing or collecting the data or providing the data. A slide was presented this morning. I don't remember the exact word, but I think it was to the effect that do it right the first time and then reuse that data rather than being all over the place and then trying to, at the back end, trying to work on the quality. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the majority of the presentation because due to the work, but anything. But then who set it up the right from the beginning, from the get-going, the right format and the right data to collect?
Dr. Schrag's not here. I think she had to leave, but I know they're working on data standards in the quote unquote real world setting. So there are attempts by different groups to do standardized data and other aspects of uniformity. I think it's a big discussion that I think would take probably its own workshop.
Oh yeah. Good idea. It's a great idea. And anyone who wants to come up, thank you so much for this. And then afterwards, after the closing session, a lot of us will stay here for a conversation.
So apologies from Dr. Schreck. She did have to leave a little early because of an issue with her flight, but I want to thank everyone who stuck it out to the end, but also just in general, thank you everyone who attended today and those of you who had joined us online. I think that this was a really tremendous workshop in that I learned a lot, and I think that I'm hearing from a lot of people that they've learned a lot, and I think that that's a true sign of success in itself. I would like to thank the organizing committee, particularly Sarah Martin, Libby, and Trevin, AACR, all of the folks, the staff who are here who made this run oh so smoothly. Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for them? My co-chairs and I had some great ideas, but none of it would have been possible without them. So thank you, and thank you to the FDA staff who also helped in the details and making sure that all of this was possible. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great weekend.
It's overnight. The minute I was thinking to hold you back, the moment I was wishing. It's overnight. The minute I was thinking to hold you back, the moment